Director of Gift Planning, and I'm also the Director of the McAllen Society, which is our legacy society. Maybe you've noticed if you frequent our power hours that my background here, I'm actually in my office. I'm very excited. I've been going once a week or so, trying to get there twice a week, but it does feel like some type of normalcy, which is very exciting. So I'm here on the Queens campus. So welcome to everyone. I know it's a beautiful day out there. And then the fact that you signed on to the Power Hour, that's terrific. We appreciate it. We're celebrating President's Week. I hope if any of you are taking the day off or the week off, I hope you're having a good week so far. And we know that the presidency has been in the news like forever. And what we mentioned, I think, on our registration page, whether you liked him or not, President Trump has certainly made quite a name for himself and has certainly kind of changed the way we look at the presidency, I think. And politics in general has just been a roller coaster ride. And we are very fortunate here today to have Professor Diane Heith. She's the former chair of government and politics at St. John's University. She has quite a stellar background. She has her BA in government at Cornell University and her master's and PhD in political science at Brown University. And she has published a lot of articles and books all about public opinion, elections, campaigns. So I think we picked the right expert to talk about this subject. And I'm really looking forward to what you have to say now that we're post-Trump, and what does this mean for the Biden presidency. So without ado, I will turn the screen over to Diane. Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for inviting me. And thank you so much to those of you who on such a beautiful day are going to sit and listen to me. And I do appreciate the people who are still willing to actually listen to politics, because you know, if you're not having to take courses because you're in college, you might want to be done right now. You might feel a little drained right now with everything.
It's so true.
It is.
So true. Yeah.
It is.
Well, I just want to interject, just so everyone knows, that they will be getting a recording, and it goes up on our YouTube channel. So if anyone has missed this, if you know of anyone that wanted to see it, just let our office know and we can get a recording to you so you can hear all the good stuff that Diane is about to tell us. So you're on.
Thank you. So Susan asked me to do the Power Hour back in November, which seems like 100 years ago at this point. And it was a few weeks after the election. And, you know, she's thinking about 2021. She's looking ahead and President's Day, which we're finally here. And she said, would you be interested in speaking? And I said, sure, of course, I'd be happy to do it. But as we talked about what we're going to do, and you know, we're sort of finishing the conversation, she says to me, basically what everybody was asking me at the time, what's going on? Who won? Is Trump going to leave? Is Biden going to be president? Is it all legal? What is going on? And for many of you, I'm sure sitting and watching felt the same way. Like, I don't understand this. This is not normal. I assured her, with all the certainty that comes from being an academic, sure, Biden's going to be president. I wasn't worried about it. I was confident that he had been duly elected. I was confident that he was going to be awarded his 306 Electoral College votes on December 14th. And then I was confident on January 6th that he was going to be duly certified by the Congress of the United States. And I was confident, I felt okay, no matter how messy it had all been, because I was confident in the thousands of people that carry out our federal elections. I was confident they were all doing their jobs. I believed there was no widespread theft or fraud. You know, I was pretty confident we weren't living in an episode of Scandal or Dynasty or whatever soap opera you want to name that has had these extraordinary stories of election theft. I was confident because, not just because I believe in stuff and democracy, I was confident because there are so many steps, there are so many people, there are so many things that have to happen, that if there was fraud, small fraud or widespread fraud, we would know. It would come out. It would be discovered. It would be handled. And it would be handled the way it was supposed to be handled, through law enforcement, through the court system. But I wasn't worried about it because the poll workers, the vote counters, the party officials who watched the proceedings, the vote counting machines worked the way they were supposed to do. Everybody was doing what they were supposed to do. The courts in multiple jurisdictions responded to the court cases offered by the Trump campaign, which they were allowed to do. 62 cases. 61 rejected the premise that there was fraud. There was one case that found errors, but those errors were not material to the outcome of the race that it was involved. So, as highlighted in the impeachment trial, if any of you happen to watch it, many of the judges took the time to note that the cases completely lacked evidence, and that this was destructive for democracy. And these judges were annoyed. They were annoyed that their time was wasted, and they said so. And the Trump lawyers even admitted in some of their filings that there was no demonstrated fraud. So I wasn't worried about any of that. What I and others, though, worried a little bit about was not the election, not the process, but the wild card. The wild card was Donald Trump. Donald Trump refused to concede. That was new. We hadn't had that before. And you may have heard mention of elections 1876, and of course, you probably remember 2000. Those races took a while to sort out, so there wasn't any expected concession in that time. In both 1876 and 2000, there was something to process, something that had to occur in order to produce the outcome. In 2000, you remember it had to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get settled. In 1876, a congressional commission was created because Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina sent two sets of electoral college votes, meaning that they had two slates. And if you remember, if you watched on January 6th, before all the horrible stuff happened, Mike Pence was standing up there and he kept saying that the slate submitted by the state of whatever was regular in form and duly authenticated. And are there any challenges? Hearing none, I certify, it's certified. So when you have two sets, or it's not duly authenticated and all of that, that's when there were legitimate challenges. And in 1876, it led to the creation of a commission to try to figure out how to sort it out. We didn't have any of that. On December 14th, the Electoral College sent singular slates from every state. There were some challenges, only one or two duly certified by or duly challenged in both houses of both chambers of Congress, but neither was challenged by a majority. And so everything proceeded regularly. So December 14th, January 6th, the process was not like either 1876 or 2000. So even in the objections that we heard in those states, Congress voted by large majorities that each state was regular in form, authentic, and accepted. So the only thing that was not routine, not regular in form, was Donald Trump. and I say this as a scholar, not as a partisan, but this was like so much of his presidency. He didn't do the expected thing. He used the power of the bully pulpit, the power of the office of the presidency, to do something no one else had ever done: call the election fraudulent with no evidence. President Trump never conceded, tweeted almost continuously that Biden did not beat him, did not earn his 306 electoral college votes. That behavior, that strategy resulted in a not so peaceful transfer of power and the second impeachment, which we just finished. I'm not a lawyer. I don't focus on anything First Amendment or the meaning of incitement or any of that stuff. As a presidency scholar, I'm focused on leadership and communication and how the institution of the presidency functions or doesn't function. This period from November 3rd to January 20th, we call it the transition because it's usually what happens. We move from one administration to another. And in this case, we didn't transition. The normal transfers of power did not occur because Trump didn't allow it to. And this period is pretty emblematic of the entire Trump presidency, in that it was unusual, it was unexpected, and it was divisive. What President Trump did post November 3rd was unprecedented in history, but it wasn't necessarily out of character for the presidency. How important is any of this? I mean, it was obviously very tense, very concerning in the moment, but bigger picture, how much does any of this matter? What does it mean for the president? What does it mean for the presidency? What does it mean for leadership? How important was what President Trump did and how different he was? If we look at the last 4 months, we look at the last 4 years, but we can spend all our time talking about all of that. But what really interests scholars is not only what happened, but what does it mean going forward? What has permanently changed, if anything? What lingers? What is shaping the presidency going forward and shaping the Biden administration? And so the larger question we always ask, how important is a single presidency? When are single presidents critical presidencies? These are the questions that I spend a lot of my time trying to ask and answer and share with my students and hopefully you guys today. I'm going to switch to PowerPoint. And so somebody just give me a thumbs up that it actually turns on once I share, because that's what all, let's see, this is different. Okay, here we go. That's what all presenters in the Zoom era now, or the WebEx era now, live in horror of, that it doesn't.
We can see it, Diane.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I spend all my time now telling all my students about that, the lawyer with the cat face on, because isn't that the worst nightmare, that you think you're presenting a serious thing and you look like a cat to everybody who's, if you haven't seen it, go YouTube it, because it's pretty funny. So for scholars, there are lots of questions that we try to, ask and answer. And there are 3 large ways that we look at the presidency. We can look at the individual, where we focus on their skills, their approach, what kind of leader they are, how they talk to people, how they work with people, their agenda, their successes, their failures. We can also look at the institution, the people, the patterns, the behaviors, the pressures, and we can look at the system or the environment in which the president functions. And using any or all of these theories, individual, institutional, or systemic, we can determine the differences or similarities of Trump as president, and then also the Trump presidency. And we can then make predictions or hypotheses about where we're going and how this matters for the Biden administration and what matters for the long term. So by many measures, we know that President Trump has been disruptive. Disruption is not always a bad thing. It's not a negative. It's just a statement of change. And if you think about it in business, disruption is how we get new products, new opportunities. Business people love to point to Uber and the iPhone as classic disruptive forces. It changed shape, it shook up industries, the way of delivering rides and the creation of ride shares and phone and computer services. I mean, the life we live in the post-iPhone era is very different than what life existed beforehand. Trump is similarly disruptive. We just don't know if it's an immediate change or it's a change to the industry. And that we will have to see as time goes on, but we can speculate, we can make hypotheses about this based on what we know has existed before. And this is a lot of what I do. And actually, my most recent book actually does this in that it focuses on a particular aspect of President Trump's leadership, and that is his communication and public leadership, the way he spoke to us, talked to us, tweeted out us. That's what I wanted to look at and evaluate. Is it different? Was it different? Was it simply different in style and form, or was it different in terms of substance and outcome? And so, the focus on this gets so much attention because it's loud, it's in your face, it's very different from what presidents did before. But again, that's not necessarily bad or good, it's just different. It's the outcome that you need to evaluate to determine what effect that he has. And so the press, pundits, supporters, and opponents alike always focused on the way he did the presidency, the way he functioned as president. Some considered it disruptive and violating norms. Some considered it disruptive and a good change for the better. So in my book, I focus on how Trump as an individual and also the institution of the Trump White House, how they exercised public leadership and how different it was from what had come before. And I argue that President Trump was disruptive to the institutional norms that developed over time. He changed and used the institution differently. And he did this on a lot of levels, most of which were not obvious for the outside world, except in the effect of what we saw. And so he had less communication staff and less coordination across the executive branch. And what's so interesting about this for scholars, the fact that he had less people doing this job of making speeches, coordinating behavior. The reason why he had less people and then had less coordination with the executive branch, the bureaucracy, he did it for the exact reason, the exact opposite reason as to why this whole thing expanded in the first place, why presidents had hundreds of people working for them, doing polling or using polling and writing speeches and coordinating events. Past presidents wanted to expand their capacity to exercise public leadership. They wanted lots of staff with expertise, and it's kind of campaign-like expertise, the performance expertise, the PR kind of expertise. So politics, but a spin, a particular way of doing politics. And so more and more people And this didn't matter whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. We got more and more because Republican or Democrat both recognized that this was valuable to giving the president extra constitutional power. And by that, I mean the fact that the Constitution actually doesn't give the presidency a lot of authority to act in the area of like making legislation. He has to get Congress to do it. He or she has to get Congress to act. Can't force them to do it. So one of the things that the presidents have learned since FDR over time, radio, then television, then the internet, is that connecting with the public can be valuable for pressuring Congress to act. So if you want Congress to act, you need help getting them to do it, and the public was a source of that. All the presidents we've had prior to Trump did this by expanding their expertise in this area. Trump didn't want that. Trump wanted individual control over his media message and his media behavior. And it makes sense, right? I mean, that was the life that he had lived. He was in charge of it. And, you know, before tweeting, you know, he apparently was the one calling up the Post and dropping hints and gossip and things like that, and being in the public eye. He alone did it and wanted to continue that type of approach, even though it was not something that presidents had done. And so you might ask yourself, well, you know, okay, so what's the big deal? I mean, now we have Twitter. It's easy for an individual to do that. Why not? Why is that a problem? So it's not a problem in that I'm saying, oh, it's a bad thing. It's a problem because of what happens. When you don't have people to coordinate across the executive branch, you don't get a coherent message. And giving control, singular control to the president, the most significant side of it is what I would call a loss of vetting, a loss of checking. It's like having somebody, you know, edit your stuff before you send it to the publisher, having your mom check your homework before you turn it in. Having another set of eyes on it means mistakes don't go out. And that didn't happen with this president. There was a loss of that control from the institution. And again, Trump wanted that. This was intentional. And so this choice resulted in a different kind of leadership. Now, I would argue it shrunk the capacity to lead, but you could also argue that it just gave the president a different capacity to lead, to exercise a different kind of leadership. But it was not the kind of leadership we had seen presidents employ before, primarily to achieve agenda success in Congress. Now, there's a whole other conversation you can have about the fact that President Trump didn't have all that much agenda success in Congress. And maybe this is part of the reason why he switched to doing more executive orders and things like that. And you don't need fancy, high, expansive communication staff to do executive order kind of leadership. It's a different type of behavior. So this was significant. The second thing that was hugely significant was the relationship with the press. Now, if we step back for a minute about the role of the press for the president, historically, it's been pretty important for the expansion of presidential power. And, you know, prior to, you know, the internet era, everything was controlled by television. The president rarely went live, excuse me, but when they were live, it was on TV, on TV or on the radio. And when it was on TV or on the radio, it wasn't like the president spoke and then they turned it off and went on to something else. It was a thing, it was an event. And there was a lot of news coverage, speculation, opinion, conversation around what the president did. So nothing ever escaped presidential review. It was translated for us. And that can be good for us, or it can be problematic because it puts the press spin on whatever it is that the president is trying to do. And it puts the press spin in terms of how the president delivered it. Like, you know, George W. Bush never got any credit for being a good speaker. It wasn't, you know, really his skill. On the flip side, Obama was considered such a good speaker that after a certain point, the press was almost nasty about it, you know, sort of saying, well, that wasn't a home run, it was only a triple, which, I mean, you know, it's a little hard to live up to after a while. And so during the television age, presidents love this attention, probably because the control meter, it was a little more on the side of presidents in that they were delivering the media, the message. Sure, it was critiqued and commented on, but in the, you know, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it just wasn't that oppressive. It wasn't that large. Now, granted, post Watergate, the relationship with the press starts to sour. You know, when you have presidents lying about policy in Vietnam and it gets uncovered in the press, and then you have Watergate and that lying, you know, it starts to tarnish the relationship. And then they start lying about all sorts of political stuff. Many of you in the audience might remember Gary Hart and the monkey business boat and him saying, you know, follow me. And they, not surprisingly, followed him and found out he was having an affair and pretty much ended his career. My students don't know anything about that. They like, what? That's history. And, you know, so we move from lying about policy and political affairs to lying about personal things, which of course blows up with the Clinton presidency and impeachment. But all of this was an increased focus on the president, not just policy, not just politics, but also personal and style and all of this stuff. And it was very intense. And there were more and more people covering it. And so what did presidents and their staffs do? They sought other means to connect with the public. They started by traveling around the country, making speeches. My previous book was all about this. And then once you get the internet, they start doing YouTube. They have a White House website. And the whole reason to do this is to get around the negative Washington press corps, to get to the other news organizations, which maybe aren't quite so critical. This was pretty standard, this kind of push-pull. Obama, George W. Bush had terrible relationships with the press, but neither of them worked so hard as President Trump did personally to undermine the institution of the press itself, the job they do for us. And so there's a relatively famous quote now from Leslie Stahl from CBS's 60 Minutes, who told an interviewer at the Deadline Club in 2018 that she once asked Trump why he kept attacking the press. And he said, according to her, and he never said that he didn't say this, I do it to discredit you all and to demean you all so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. And so this diminishment of the press, plus what I call the breaking of the accountability loop, basically this idea that the press exists to hold the president, hold public officials accountable. If you don't think the press is trustworthy or nonpartisan or doing an appropriate job, well, then you're not going to believe them when they critique people you like and trust. And this was huge. This was huge. He was much more effective than any other president in successfully going around the press to get to supporters. Some of that was his tweeting, and I talk about that in a very different way. But some of that was also just how he treated the press and encouraged others to treat the press. With the exception of Fox News. Fox News he treated quite well for a while. However, whenever Fox did something he didn't like or said something he didn't like, they were treated to very similar rampages of tweets, all intended to diminish whatever it was that they said. And so what's the consequence of this? It was hugely significant, particularly on a partisan level, that people who believed and trusted Trump believed what he said about the press and believed what he was saying was true. People who didn't like Trump nearly so much didn't feel the same way and viewed the press differently. And so we ended up with two different perspectives on the world, particularly about political things. And more problematic, and this again is as scholars, how do we look at, what do we look at the problems as being? If you don't trust the source of information, if you don't trust where you get your information, you're certainly not going to trust what they tell you. And what Trump emphasized for the last 4 years and what his diehard supporters really believed, you cannot trust anyone but him. And his most loyal supporters believe that. And how do we know that to be true? Is that just things that people say? Well, no, we ask people. This is what polling data tells us. And we can also look at people's actions. So a couple of slides to sort of show you what I mean. So this is from 2019. Republicans place trust in one source, Fox News, far more than any other. They trust Fox. So when Fox supports what the president says, people believe them. When Fox challenges the president, you see a differential in how it plays out in terms of support from Republicans and diehard supporters of Trump. It's challenging. Two friends of mine, two scholars, really interesting work that they do. They did something years ago about intra-party criticism versus inter-party criticism. And what they found is kind of what most of us know intuitively, that when a Democrat says something bad about a Republican, everybody says, whatever, it's just politics. When a Republican says something bad about a Democrat, whatever, it's just politics. When a Republican says something bad about a Republican or a Democrat says something bad about a Democrat, it resonates more than anything else, because that intra-family fighting signals to people that this matters, that this is serious. And so, if you think about the impeachment that just happened, did anybody think 67 Republicans were going to vote to convict? Probably not. But getting 7 Republicans to say that what Trump did was wrong and that the election was not fraudulent, and then to get Mitch McConnell gave a blistering speech saying that he should, face criminal charges practically, but he didn't vote for impeachment because of a technicality. Now you can get into a lot of what McConnell did and how he played it, but it was a pretty blistering speech. And so, that's 8 people who are basically saying internally, I disagree. And there's power in that. There's power when Fox News has to say, under threats of lawsuit, that they can no longer say that the Dominion, the election machines that they were not hacked or badly run, that, you know, when they have to change that, you know, and offer a retraction, that has a powerful message when you trust them. If you don't trust them, it doesn't mean anything. So what else do we know? Social media users had much less faith in the public in accepting the election results. And so what do we mean by social media? Who are social media users? Primarily, we're talking about people who get information via tweet and via Facebook. You know, I mean, a lot of people use Instagram, but it's not as politically relevant. And so, of course, who's leading out front on Facebook and Twitter? And that was President Trump. And so they worried. They thought there was a high degree of potential for fraud. And we saw how much this mattered in real time. Political scientists, we never do anything in real time. I mean, we talk about elections, we talk about impeachment, but we never get data in real time. In 2020, we did. And we did in terms of COVID. We saw in real time how trusting or not trusting changed people's behavior. It meant people behaved differently. So this is from March of 2020. And this is how people felt about coronavirus. And it was striking how differently Democrats and independents felt or worried about coronavirus than did Republicans. Republicans worried at a lag, sort of the best way to put it, in that Republicans did not challenge the messaging they were getting from their leadership, which is this was not that much of a problem, until they were challenged by facts on the ground and it started spreading. So you could argue that Democrats and Republicans were the same, that, you know, there are more Democrats in the heavier hit initial coronavirus areas, and as it spread, people's attitudes changed. So maybe we could just say that it was experience. It wasn't leadership. It wasn't paying attention to Donald Trump or Fox News, that it was actually experiencing it. And who was experiencing coronavirus in March? You know, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Washington, California, areas that are heavily Democratic. Okay, we can take that that argument, and we were able to test it because of what was going on. You know, how this translated belief in the information we received. How seriously did you take the coronavirus? How necessary was it to shut the country down? And were you going to wear a mask? These are things that we could actually test, that we could actually look at. And so we saw this start to show up in in things like how Trump was handling it. And so just, you know, right off the bat, I mean, that's kind of crazy disparity. Republicans thought he was doing, you know, a great job in March, and Democrats did not. So is that all just Democrat Republican partisanship? You know, Democrats were never going to say that Trump was doing a good job. Okay, we can take that. We can, you know, let's see what that looks like. It's not just approval, it's trust. And what do we know about the crisis, and what do we do about the crisis? One of the things about crisis leadership is it's about your response to it. If you need to be told what to do, you have to trust the person who's telling it to you. And so that starts to become a serious problem beginning in March over the issue of coronavirus. And so this was, I think this was by April. And so this actually also brings us the independents as well. So not just Democrats and Republicans. Who do you trust to provide you with reliable information? The CDC, Anthony Fauci, your state officials, the WHO, the news media. Look how far a drop there was. Do you believe the news media was going to tell you the truth about coronavirus? Now, what's interesting is that drop off is even with Democrats as well. So, so the news media has lost a lot of trust in the last 4 years, longer as well. But President Trump, it is a huge disparity overall with the rest of the public officials. And for Republicans, you know, it's not as large a drop off between who they trust and who they don't. Of course, the news media is the least trusted for them. And as expected, Democrats polar opposite to Republicans. But as you can see here, it's the independents who are driving Trump's trust factor. That it's not just Democrats not trusting what he has to say about coronavirus, it's also independents. So all this is about Trump, and, you know, again, you know, so many books have been written about him, and so many more will probably be. But the question for us is, does it matter? How much does this matter? Does it matter for Biden? Biden has said and campaigned on it, I'm not going to beat Trump. I'm not going to beat Trump. And that's how he's campaigning. He is not going to be Trump. And he's not. And we've seen that from day one. And all the little things that I pointed out in the beginning that, well, I didn't talk about all of them, but all these things that they weren't doing, like they stopped giving press briefings, those are back. Biden is meeting more with the press in more traditional settings, as opposed to the non-traditional settings that that Trump liked to do. Both Biden and his press secretary are much less confrontational, and they're clearly accepting the role of the press to challenge what the president has to say, to hold elites accountable. The biggest difference, of course, is Biden's not tweeting. He's not reaching out to us and engaging us individually, and he's not driving media attention through the use of Twitter. But it's not just that. There's the environment. Remember we said in the beginning, the individual, the institution, it's the environment. And the environment that Biden was left with is one we've had for a while. It's not all Trump, but Trump has heightened it. And that is the hyper-partisanship, plus the idea that only Trump can fix things, that he was the solution, that only Trump tells the truth, everyone else is lying. Whereas there seems to be a real challenge to that. And, you know, this is the first president we've had where, you know, you have a major newspaper organization keeping track of how often he tells untruths. Biden is not doing any of those things, but he's going to have a hard time ignoring that approach and ignoring the environment. And he's going to have to deal with it. He's going to have to acknowledge where we are and focus on how to manage it. And we know this matters. If you just look at COVID, it's not style. Substance matters as well. I think you could argue that Trump could have been reelected even with COVID had he handled it better, but he didn't. And he was judged for his poor handling of this crisis. And if you think about it, what does the presidency exist for? Crisis management is number one on that list. And Trump is upside down in his approval on the crisis, right? More people disapprove by a wide margin than approved of the job that he was doing. So it's not just the split Democrats and Republicans, it's independents and some Republicans not approving of the job. Now, he did get the normal buoying of support that we call the rally around the flag in the middle, but it very quickly dissipates. And it very quickly dissipates, not because COVID gets so bad, although it does, but also because of what Trump was doing. And so I have something here, which is actually a little hard to read, but this is data from an article of mine that's under review. So it's not published yet, but hopefully it will be soon. And this is data which shows us things that go together versus not going together. So I'm not saying that COVID caused President Trump's approval rating to go down. And I'm also not saying that Trump's tweeting made his approval rating go down. What I'm saying is that they're correlated together. So it's correlation, not causation. You might have heard that saying before. So if you look at some of what you have here, and so this is, do you disapprove of the job that he's doing versus COVID cases? And do you disapprove, and that you can see that they're actually correlated. It's actually more significantly correlated with COVID deaths. As the more people died this year, the more people disapproved of how President Trump was handling it. But more interesting to me, because I'm focused on leadership, was about his speech when he spoke to us and then when he tweeted. And what we know is that, and what I'm showing here is that approval and his remarks and approval and his tweets were very highly correlated. They went together. But if you remember, his approval went down. So he's tweeting and his approval ratings going down, and these things are going together. So am I saying that there's a relationship between approval, disapproval, COVID speech? I can't say that it's causing it, but I can say there is a relationship, that rhetoric tracked with approval and approval went down while disapproval increased. And so if you think again about the election, if you say, if not for COVID, Trump would have won re-election, I think this data shows that that's not true, in that it's not COVID per se. It's what he was doing. And what he was doing, people didn't like and responded negatively to it. But again, I can't say it caused it, because you just can't show that kind of interaction because the data is just not that effective. So what do we see from Biden? It's super early. There is no way it's the same level of comparison. But just on a base level, he's not upside down, right? He's more people approve, and it's a significant amount of people approving. There's a lot you can say about approval ratings and whether they mean anything, but what we do know is that it gives you space. It's a shaping of the environment. It says that people aren't unhappy. Does that give you room as president to work? I think it does. I think having the trial behind him will also give Biden room to work. But what we fundamentally know is that it is a problem for presidents when they don't have that kind of environment. And so Biden is going to benefit from the fact that right now people are giving him the benefit of the doubt. But once you start doing things, you're going to get pushback from doing them. And I think that that's significant. You know, how the public responds to the choices being made to solve COVID is going to matter for that approval rating, and it's going to matter for Biden's ability to be successful. So I think there is so much here. There's so much more I can talk about. I mean, I could obviously just keep going. So I'm going to stop here so that I can take some questions if anybody has them. I see there are a couple in the typed into the chat. And I think that the thing that's most important to focus on here is that leadership is more than style. And the Trump team had a very different style. That wasn't what was problematic, right? And so changing style to Biden isn't necessarily what's going to solve any of the things that seemingly need solving. And a different level of competency, a different approach to government is what we have in place now. And that potentially is going to matter significantly. Susan, do you want me to answer the questions that were posted?
Yes, that would be wonderful. We could
Okay,
read them to you, or
I can see them as well.
You can? Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great. Then
So
we'll leave
I don't know
it
if everybody
to you.
else can, but
No, they can't actually.
Oh, okay.
The way
So
that
if you want to read
the
them,
way
go
it's set
ahead.
up. Yeah, I think we'll have to read them.
Yeah.
Sorry if you're seeing my hands here because I'm on the phone. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. Do you think the Republican Party will split into two, a pro-Trump party and a center-right conservative party? Very good question.
So that is super interesting. And I don't think I have that slide in that. Actually, I wonder if I can try to find it. But because I showed this to my students, was it yesterday or last Thursday? This idea of a Trump Patriot Party, which is what he would supposedly call it. And it was, let me see if I can find it. It was really interesting, this idea that could this happen and what and how it would work. And so we have had periods in history where the two parties have blown up over issues, and we've gotten a resorting of groups, and we've gotten a different type of politics. The most dramatic of that happened around the Civil War. We went into the election of 1860 with 4 different parties. We came out of it with 2, the Republicans and the Democrats. And so, you know, we never know when we're going to get these kinds of transformational periods when things are going to change. In the case of the Republican Party, it sort of seems like there are 2 halves, that there's this totally in love with Trump and then totally not in love with Trump focus. The election doesn't bear that out, right? 74 million people voted for Trump for president. We don't know what they want, right? We don't know why they voted. Did they vote just because, you know, I have to vote Republican because, you know, Biden is going to turn into AOC and we can't have that? Or did they vote for Trump because they truly love Trump? There's no way for us to know unless you ask them, and we can't ask all 74 million people. So I also think there's a difference between elite active people in Washington, elite active people in the country, and then everybody else who just labels themselves Republican or Democrat. And so I think there is a split in those active Washington people. You know, that there's a fight raging in Washington in the Congressional Republican Party. We don't know how far, how deep that split is, across the country. It is striking how different those groups are in terms of what they want. But people have said, you know, the last time people thought the Republican Party was going to blow up, it was over abortion, pro-life versus, you know, was that going to be a permanent litmus test? And they weathered that. So can they weather this? I don't know. It is really hard to tell how powerful this schism is. You could see that there were a lot of Republicans really upset, despite the vote, about how Pence was treated. And that if the vote for impeachment was by secret ballot, we might have saw a different outcome. But practically speaking, a split is not a good way to win. It will be difficult for a third party, you know, whoever gets ownership of the Republican Party name will have an easier time running candidates and winning than another party, particularly if Trump is never allowed back on Twitter or Facebook. So I don't know. My instinct is to say that it's not going to split permanently, but that there are going to be these two fighting wings that are going to be, that there's going to be tension between. On the other hand, it's also still really close. And if we look at that data that focuses on how much do you believe Trump about the election? And as that lie has been more and more exposed, it's really separated out those who believe everything that Trump has said versus those people who are starting to say, well, maybe it's not true because Biden's president. You know, it's that deep conspiracy attitude. We don't know how widespread that is. It's getting a lot of press and a lot of attention, especially with Marjorie Taylor Greene and that pressure, but we don't know how widespread those attitudes actually are. And it makes it harder to guess how significant it's going to be. But my response right now would be to say, no, I don't think it's going to happen. Okay.
We have a second question. Do you think it is a good idea to establish a 9/11 type bipartisan commission to investigate what happened on January 6th? And how might it affect Biden's ability to heal the nation?
I do think it's really valuable because we need to know everything that happened. And I think if you separate it out from attitudes about Trump and desire to punish Trump, we'll learn a lot more. And I think how we treat individuals who try to kidnap the governor of Michigan and try to take over and assassinate the vice president of the United States, I think these things matter. And we need to know what happened. And we need it not to be rumors. It was really important that the 9/11 Commission happened. You know, and we wouldn't have had that if not for the brave widows from Manhasset fighting desperately to get it to happen, because the Bush administration did not want our failures to be revealed. There's always that instinct to not show what went wrong. But we learned a lot by doing it. We learned what needed to be fixed. And I think you can make similar arguments as being necessary here. I also would hope that maybe if we figured out where things went wrong and what to do better, we wouldn't have to have such an armed camp lockdown feeling in Washington, D.C. Anybody who's been there and the beauty of being able to walk around in this gorgeous seat of government that we have. It's sort of heartbreaking to see it all closed off and the public not allowed in. So somebody sent another message and it disappears really quickly. I don't know where.
I know it does. There is another question here too, but I think you basically answered it in your presentation about Biden's press conferences. Do you believe that his press conferences now have restored the trust between the presidency and the press? Definitely is a difference. I see a difference in the press now.
There's a difference in the relationship, I think, but trust, it's not so much the trust between them that I care about. It's between us and them and sort of that triangle. And that is going to take a lot more effort. So I found the other question, and that is about changing the way we voted for years in terms of in-person to mail-in ballots when things like retail stores and supermarkets were open all over the country. Do you think that these types of changes lend to the idea that the election could have been in question? It's weird because some states have been doing mail-in ballots for 20 years. And they do it really well and they don't have any fraud. There's never been a problem. Things don't get stolen. Other states have difficulty doing it. I think the problem is in the sense of that, and I think what the question is pointing to is this idea that, why do we have to change it on the fly? And that, was it really necessary to do this in the middle of COVID when everything was so problematic? Well, we know in states that didn't do that, and I think it was Wisconsin that was the most significant happenstance of this. They didn't change the way they did anything, and a lot of people got sick, and that scared election officials around the country, and it also made them worry about not having enough poll workers to run it normally. And so how then were you going to manage it? How are you going to deal with the process of the election? And so each state gets to deal with this on its own. And that's the thing that was so interesting about like the Pennsylvania, the desire to challenge the Pennsylvania process. The Pennsylvania process was agreed to and put out there by the Republican legislature in Pennsylvania. And so do we trust the states to make these choices? We vote for them, right? So, I mean, the people in Pennsylvania, were they unhappy with this process? That gets channeled through the legislative process. They have their representative. They can complain to them. And then the process, you vote and make your choices. They all did that in a legal, in advance of the election time period. And so I think the fact that every state made the decision that they felt was necessary for them is important here, because I think as the questioner points out, retail stores and supermarkets were open all over the country, but they were open differently, right? Like in some places they were limited in terms of how many people could come in. You had to wear a mask, all of these different processes. So the idea of changing the process wasn't, sort of unheard of because it was COVID. And clearly people were very much afraid of participating in large, massive numbers. I mean, if you think about the number of things that we normally do crowded, I mean, it's mind-boggling to think about now, like, would you be comfortable with it? And that comfort level really relates to how seriously you viewed your likelihood of getting COVID and that transmission process. And if you remember, now it's been so long, but if you remember now back to March, April, here in New York, people were terrified because people were really sick and dying. And I think that really influenced how you felt about what was necessary to do. Now, does this mean that it was handled well? Nope. I was one of those people in June who got their primary ballot the day after you were supposed to vote. So I went and I voted in person and was really pissed off that it showed up in the mail the next day. So it wasn't really smooth, and you could understand why people would say, well, could I have voted twice? No, because there were checks on this. So, it wasn't smooth. But it was a recognition of what was going on at the time. But again, I think that's different than talking about voting machines getting hacked, bags of votes showing up, all of these things that got blown up. It's very different to talk about whether we should have changed the process as opposed to, was the process itself fraudulent? And I don't think any of these processes were fraudulent. They didn't promote double voting. Dead people weren't voting en masse. All of those things, there's been no evidence of it. And I just don't believe that you could have a conspiracy that good that we wouldn't know, that we wouldn't be able to see it, when so much of this is so transparent and so public. So I think, that's kind of where I go with this. But could it have been handled better, smoother in each of these states? Absolutely. You can always say that.
We need to have you come back in the fall as we, when we get our elections again and talk about this, because I have tons of questions for you, but I know we're running out of time. But I do agree with you. I think it could have been handled a lot better. And I think, if you go back to, Hillary and the way she felt about the elections, I think our trust in the election system, I think, started to deteriorate a lot sooner than this time around with Trump. I think just Trump was, the icing on the cake.
If you ever want that conversation, I can do a whole thing for you on our attitudes and public opinion and all that. But one thing I would say about trust and the role of leadership, if you want to see how it's supposed to be done, watch the YouTube video of Al Gore's concession speech. Because remember, Al Gore loses, even though he has way more popular vote, he loses a tied electoral college because the Supreme Court says stop voting. And he also loses because Ralph Nader insisted on running, and he gets 90,000 votes in the state of Florida. So the 1,500 that Al Gore could have gotten had they not stopped the hanging Chad count, people were screamingly angry in 2000. And if you read that speech, I'm editing my co-author and I, we do a textbook, and this for our third edition. One of the things that I'm grabbing is Gore's speech versus Trump's tweets. And it's painful how different it is. And, you can get into a whole thing about whether he incited anything, but clearly he didn't tamp it down. He didn't tell people to stop and accept it, which is what everybody else has had to sort of suck up and do when you lose.
Right. Well, he didn't accept it, so
right.
He's going to have to tell everybody else.
And it's huge. I think that's so, because if you trust somebody and they tell you that it was stolen, you're going to believe them. And so that's what we have to work on. How do we trust? How do we know who to trust? And how do we all agree on what's true and what's fact? That's the problem. That's where we are.
Well, if we can solve that, if we could solve that, that would be great, because I do agree with you on that. Also, when you talked about social media, anybody has not seen Social Dilemma on Netflix, I think that's, as much as we know how social media works, the way they describe it, and these are the guys that, they're the creators of a lot of the social media, and they're telling you on this program, Social Dilemma, they're telling you we don't even have our kids go on social media. We tell them to put the phones away, and you're like, what? You created this whole thing, and now at the end they basically tell you cancel all your accounts, because it's in a lot of ways very biased, because if you're thinking one way, you're always going to get that messaging, and you're never going to get the messaging from both sides. So I think that has that's an issue. I think it resonates in politics, because if we want people to look at both sides of an agenda, how can they look at both sides of the agenda if we have the social media that's feeding only one opinion to people based on, based on what they've been posting, or likes and so forth, so I think that's why the country is very, very divided.
Yeah, we live in bubbles, and if you never get any information from outside your bubble, of course you think other people are nuts, because you never hear the contrary.
You don't hear the other. Exactly.
But what's much worse than that is we've moved from not just thinking other people are nuts or wrong to thinking they're evil and should be, not allowed to participate. And it's that step. It's that step we need to pull everybody back from. And,
right.
We've always had crazies. They're just, the social media allows them so much larger of a voice. One of the most startling things that shouldn't have been a surprise, yet everybody was surprised, was that once Trump was kicked off of Twitter and Facebook, the amount of lies and disinformation dropped by like 60%. Because it wasn't just him, it was the whole sphere around him. And so again, he might not be inciting it, but it's facilitating a discussion that didn't used to be so public, so out there, and bringing in so many more people.
And I don't know what the press is going to do, because he was quite the celebrity.
Oh my God, they absolutely
with the press. What are they going to talk about now?
They need to figure out how to do their job without relying on somebody tweeting. I absolutely agree. And don't get me started, like I have about the job that they do. But if you guys want me to come back to talk about any of these things, come up with
especially the election, I would love that. I'm sure we have lots of questions. Before we close, because I know we're definitely over time. Sue, I just want to make sure, did we cover everybody? Anybody send us anything in chats?
Did we answer the question about Jen Psaki?
Yes, I covered that. Yep.
Okay, we're good.
So we covered everything. Great.
Yes.
Well, this was terrific. Thank you, Dr. Heith, so much for enlightening us and making us look at it, in a good way. And I really appreciate that. It definitely opened up my mind after this discussion, and it feels better. And hopefully we can move forward in a positive way and be more united. Let's pray for that. Definitely unity, because that's what we need. So thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Again, you'll receive a recording from us. And if you have any other questions, we can certainly pass it along to the professor. But have a great, great day and enjoy your presidential week. All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.